My name is Eleanor Briggs, and I was 47 years old when my mother and my sisters stood in my late father's living room and divided up an estate they did not know was already mine. I need you to understand who I am before I tell you the rest, because the kind of woman I am is the whole reason any of this happened the way it did. I am quiet. I have always been quiet. I am the person who refills the water glasses and remembers everyone's allergies and notices when the room has gone cold. And somewhere along the way my family decided that a woman who notices everything must not need anything. And they built 30 years of assumptions on top of that single comfortable mistake. The day I am telling you about, the day after we buried my father, I stood in his kitchen with a dish towel in my hands and a stillness in my chest I had never felt before, and I understood that the story my family told about me was about to meet the story my father had quietly written down. I was tired. I was grieving. And underneath all of it, for the first time in my life, I was certain. Here is the part that kept me awake. For 2 decades my family had treated me as the helper and never the heir, and now, with my father barely in the ground, they had begun dividing up his life, as though I were a piece of the furniture they'd be selling with the house. I could hear my sister in the next room on the phone with a realtor, talking about listing the lake house by spring, talking about the lot like it was already cash in her account. And I said nothing, because 9 days from then, a sealed envelope from a lawyer none of them had ever met was going to walk into that house and tell every one of them the truth about what my father had actually decided. They thought they were burying a man and collecting a reward. They had no idea they were walking toward the one reckoning they could not narrate their way out of. Before I take you through all of it, I want to stop for just a moment and be with you, because this story still sits heavy in me. Tell me how you're doing today. Honestly, not the polite version we give strangers. And tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely love knowing how far these stories travel, how a woman speaking from a kitchen in upstate New York can reach someone sitting in a car, or a hospital waiting room, or their own kitchen halfway across the world. If you believe, the way I have come to believe, that the truth has a quiet way of finding the people who actually did the right thing, then stay with me all the way to the end, because the end is where everything turns. And if these are the kinds of stories that matter to you, consider subscribing so the next one finds you too. At the time, standing in that kitchen, twisting that dish towel, I had no idea that one envelope, and one decision my father made alone, 4 years before he died, was about to unravel a story my family had been telling about me since before I could even defend myself against it. To understand what they did, you have to understand how it started. And it started long before there was a single dollar worth fighting over. For 6 years I made the drive to the lake house every Sunday, 3 hours each way, in every season that part of the country can throw at you. I knew the road so well I could have driven it asleep. The long curve where the trees opened up and the water first appeared. The gas station where I stopped for his favorite peppermints. The gravel turn that announced I was almost there. My father, James, was dying slowly, the way the cruelest illnesses take a person, in pieces rather than all at once, and somebody had to be there for the pieces. I learned the exact schedule his medications had to follow. I learned the particular pride that made him refuse help until you disguised it as a favor to yourself. I learned to make his coffee weaker every month so he wouldn't notice we were cutting the caffeine, and I learned which chair on the porch he liked when the evening light came across the lake. I did not think of any of it as sacrifice. I thought of it as love, expressed in the only language I had ever been good at, which is the language of showing up. My older sister Vivian spoke a different language entirely, and the whole family had always preferred hers. Vivian was the sun our house orbited. Bright and quick and beautiful in a way that made teachers forgive her, and made my mother glow with a pride she never quite managed to feel for me. When Vivian did something well, it was treated as proof of her brilliance. When I did the same thing, it was simply what was expected of dependable, sensible Nell, noted with a nod and forgotten by dinner. She lived 2 hours closer to the lake house than I did, and visited maybe once a month. And when she came like weather. An armful of expensive flowers, a cashmere blanket still in its ribbon, a breathless story about how impossibly busy and important her life had become. And always an exit already scheduled before she'd taken off her coat. She would stay 2 hours and leave behind a glow that lasted my mother a week. I would stay 2 days and leave behind clean sheets, filled prescriptions, and a stocked refrigerator that no one ever mentioned. There is a specific and quiet ache in being the child who is loved for being no trouble, and I had carried it so long I'd stopped noticing its weight. My mother, Carol, had a genuine genius for narration, and I don't say that entirely without admiration, because it takes a kind of artistry to do what she did. She could take any set of plain facts and arrange them into a story in which Vivian was the heroine and I was the reliable supporting player, and she did it so smoothly and so constantly that the entire family came to believe it the way you believe the sky is up. My weekly drives became, Nell doesn't mind. She's so good at that sort of thing. Vivian missing my father's birthday became, she's just so busy, she's doing so well for herself, we're so proud. For years I privately thought my mother was simply cruel, but I understand it better now, and the truth is more ordinary and more permanent than cruelty. She had decided, long ago, maybe without ever knowing she was deciding, which of her daughters mattered, and after that every fact that arrived in her life got quietly sorted to fit the conclusion she had already reached. And there was money underneath it, though it would be a long time before I understood the shape of that. My mother had spent her whole adult life financially dependent on my father, and the terror of what would become of her when he was gone was a fear she managed by making sure that Vivian, her chosen one, would be the one holding the purse. It was my father who was different, and it took me most of my life to see it. James Briggs was a builder, a man with big careful hands and a habit of watching a room in silence before he ever offered an opinion, and for years I mistook that silence for distance. I thought he simply wasn't a warm man. It was only at the very end, in the long slow evenings when it was just the two of us and the lake going dark, that I understood he had been watching all along, keeping a private, unspoken ledger of who we actually were beneath the version of us my mother performed. He started telling me things on that porch, never all at once and never in the language of lawyers. One evening, watching the light fail over the water, he said almost to himself, "Your sister thinks the world owes her, and your mother taught her that, and I'm not sure I stopped it in time." Another night, after a visit where Vivian had pressed him hard about his finances and left him gray and exhausted in his chair, he reached over and put his heavy hand on my arm and said, "I've taken care of some things, Nell. You don't need to worry about it now. But later, you'll understand." I didn't push him. Pushing was never our way with each other. I thought he meant only that an old man had his affairs in order. I tucked the words somewhere in the back of my mind and got up to refill his water, and I had no idea I had just been handed the key to everything. So when the phone call came, when I stood in that kitchen the week after the funeral and heard my own sister carving up our father's house before the grass had grown over him, the wound was not only the greed of it, it was the ease. There was no malice in their voices, and somehow that was worse than malice would have been. They were simply continuing the story they had always told, the one in which the house was theirs, and I was the one who would dutifully help them empty it. I heard Vivian say the lot alone was worth a fortune. I heard my mother agree, warm and certain, the way she agreed with everything Vivian wanted, and instead of the old reflex rising in me, the urge to make peace, to be useful, to swallow it down and dry one more dish, something in my chest went very still and very clear. I dried the last plate and set it carefully in the rack, and I made the first deliberate choice of silence that would carry me through everything that came after. I decided I would not argue. I decided I would watch. What I watched over the following weeks would have broken my heart if my heart hadn't already begun quietly turning into something harder and far more useful. The list came first. Vivian had gone through the entire house. Our father's house, our father not 3 weeks gone, and made an inventory in her looping, confident handwriting, and she had stuck it to the refrigerator with one of his old magnets as though it were a grocery list. The dining set he had built by hand, the boat, my grandmother's jewelry, the good wool rugs, each item had a set of initials beside it claiming ownership, and almost every one of them read V, with a scattering of C for my mother across the rest. And beside my name, beside Nell, there was no item at all. There was only a note in the corner, in that same easy hand. "Nell can handle the clean-out sluss paperwork." That was the inheritance they had imagined for me. Not a single object of our father's. Just the labor of disposing of his life. I stood and read it 3 times, and I did not take it down, and I did not say a word. My mother presented the whole arrangement to me as a kindness, which was its own particular art. She took my hands one afternoon in the gesture she always used when she wanted something from me, folding them between her own, and she looked at me with the soft warmth I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn. "You understand these things, sweetheart," she said. "You're so practical. You're so much better with the details than your sister ever was. Why don't you handle everything? The paperwork, the accounts, the house?" She believed she was handing me the chores, the grim, unglamorous machinery of death, the part no one else wanted to touch. What she was actually handing me, though not one of us knew it in that moment, was every single key I would need. Because to settle an estate you must open the accounts. You must read the mail. You must learn exactly what a man owned and exactly what had been done with it. The very invisibility they had used against me my whole life, the assumption that quiet, sensible Nell would simply handle it, was about to give me the complete and unguarded run of the truth. I said, "Of course, I'll take care of it." And I meant it more completely than she could have imagined. Vivian's urgency had a reason behind it, and when I finally understood the reason, it made her more human than I wanted her to be. She was in trouble. She had borrowed against a future she had been promised her whole life. A business that had not gone the way she'd assured everyone it would, loans stacked behind it, a lifestyle she could not bear to pause, and beneath all of it the absolute certainty that the inheritance would arrive in time to make her whole. She had quite literally spent money she did not yet have, on the strength of an expectation no one had ever actually put in writing. I tell you this not to excuse a single thing she did, but because I have learned that the most dangerous people in a family are rarely monsters. They are people who have been taught that they are owed, and who will do real and lasting harm to protect the story in which they deserve everything and have earned none of it. Vivian was not evil. She was desperate and entitled, and those two things together will hollow a person out. And so I named my decision to myself, plainly, so that I would not lose my nerve when the moment came. I would not announce what I knew. I would not stand up in that living room and declare that the house was not theirs to sell. I would let them reveal themselves completely, in their own words, on their own time, and when the truth finally came it would arrive in a form they could not argue with, narrate around, or dismiss as the bitterness of the overlooked daughter. It would arrive as documents, witnessed and recorded, in my father's own deliberate intention. It was not revenge I was after, though I will not pretend there was nothing fierce and satisfying in the patience of it. It was that I had spent my entire life watching my mother overwrite my version of events with hers, and just once, I wanted the facts to speak before I did. I wanted to stand on something that could not be moved. So I began, quietly, in the evenings after the others had gone, to organize my father's files. The first real crack came in the form of a bank statement. I was sorting the grim administrative confetti that piles up after a death. The bills, the notices, the cold correspondence of institutions that do not care that a person is gone. When I found the account statements, and I made myself read them slowly, column by column, the way my father had taught me to read anything that mattered. And there they were. Withdrawals, large ones. Dated in the final months of my father's life, when he could no longer drive, when on some days he could not steady his hand enough to sign his own name, when he most certainly could not have walked into a bank and authorized the moving of that kind of money. My hands went cold against the paper. This was not the airy entitlement of a list stuck to a refrigerator. This was money, real, specific, documented money. Gone out of my dying father's accounts while he lay in the next room. I read the figures again, and a third time, and the stillness in my chest sharpened into something with an edge. It took me 2 careful days to understand exactly how it had been done. Vivian had held a durable power of attorney. She had obtained it quietly, during one of those visits where she pressed our father about his finances, and I had no doubt she'd framed it as nothing but a practical kindness. A way to help with his bills should he ever become unable to manage them himself, and then she had used it. Not for his care, I could account for his care down to the last dollar, because I was the one who had paid for most of it without ever being thanked. She had used it for transfers that benefited Vivian. I am not a lawyer, but you do not need to be one to understand that a power of attorney is not a permission slip to help yourself. It is a fiduciary duty, a serious, legally binding obligation to act only in the interest of the person who granted it. And using it to quietly enrich yourself at the expense of a dying man is not some murky moral gray area where reasonable people might disagree. It is self-dealing. It is a breach of the most basic kind of trust the law recognizes. The understanding didn't make me furious, exactly. It made me precise. I photographed every statement. I made clean copies and dated them. I built a file, and I told no one it existed. While I was quietly building that file, my family was building something of their own around me. Another story, the way my mother always built stories, except this one had a defensive purpose I recognized immediately. I began to hear things, secondhand, in the careful offhand way that gossip travels through a family. A cousin mentioned that everyone was little worried about how I was handling the grief. An old family friend said she'd heard I had always carried some resentment toward Vivian. My mother was laying the groundwork, salting the field in advance, so that if I ever dared to raise a question about the money or the house, it would land in everyone's ears as the bitterness of the jealous, overlooked sister, rather than the testimony of the one person who actually knew what had happened. It was clever and it was cold, and more than anything it told me something crucial on some level. They already knew that what they had done would not survive the light. You do not build a defense against an accusation, unless some quiet part of you already knows the accusation is true. It was in my father's study, on a gray and rain-streaked afternoon, that I found the locked drawer. His desk was old and heavy, one he had built himself decades ago, and there was a small drawer beneath the others that simply would not open. I sat there working at it, and then a memory surfaced with the suddenness of a struck match. My father, on the porch, in one of those soft medicated evenings, telling me where he kept the small things that mattered most to him. I found the key exactly where he'd said it would be, taped beneath the underside of a bookshelf, and I fitted it into the lock, and the drawer slid open. Inside, among a few old photographs and his reading glasses folded shut, was a single business card. An attorney, a woman named Margaret Cho, at a firm in the city, an hour and a half away. It was not the name of the genial old family lawyer who had drawn up my parents' wills decades earlier. The one Vivian had already been quietly in contact with. This was someone else entirely. Someone my father had gone to alone, in secret, and never once mentioned to a living soul but, perhaps, me. I sat in his chair for a long time with that card in my hand, listening to the rain, and I understood with a certainty I could feel in my bones that my father had done legal work his family knew nothing about. His words from the porch came drifting back. "I've taken care of some things, Nell." And I knew, the way you know the shape of something in a dark room, that whatever I was about to uncover had been done deliberately, quietly, and for me. He had not been a confused old man putting his affairs vaguely in order. He had been a careful builder, laying a foundation no one could see. The next morning, with my heart going hard in my chest, I called Margaret Cho's office and made an appointment, and that single phone call set in motion everything that came after. Her office was on the 11th floor, all cool glass and quiet, the kind of quiet that has been paid for, and from the moment I sat down across from her, I felt something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. I felt taken seriously. Margaret Cho was a careful, exact woman of perhaps 60, with a stillness about her that I imagine comes from spending a lifetime sitting at the precise point where grief and money meet. She confirmed without hesitation that she had represented my father. She confirmed that he had been, in her professional judgment and in the documented opinion of his own physician, entirely of sound mind on the day he came to her, and on every day they had worked together. She would not, she said gently, lay everything out for me right then. There was a proper process to these things, a formal reading, parties who by rights needed to be present together. But she looked at me steadily over the rims of her glasses and told me that I needed to be in the room when that reading happened. And then she told me one more thing before I gathered my coat to go, and I carried it out of that building like a hot coal cupped in my hands. "Your father was very clear about what he wanted, Ms. Briggs," she said. "And he was equally clear that he wanted it done correctly, so that no one would ever be able to undo it." In the weeks that followed I reconstructed the timeline, because I needed to understand not only what my father had done but precisely when he had done it, and why. The documents Margaret had let slip were roughly 4 years old. And 4 years back, when I went looking in my memory, was the season of a particular and terrible visit. The one where Vivian had cornered our father about money, about the house, about what she'd brightly called planning ahead for everyone's sake, and had left him so badly shaken that when I arrived the following morning I found him sitting alone in the dark, not having slept. I had assumed at the time it was simply a bad night, the illness having a hard day with him. I understood now that it had been the hinge on which his whole final chapter turned. That my father, in the days after that visit, had quietly arranged a car, driven himself an hour and a half into the city, sat down across from a complete stranger, and made the single decision that would protect the one thing. He still had the power to protect the truth of what he wanted, set down in a form that could never be argued away after he was gone. And then there was the deed, and the deed was the moment I knew, beyond any remaining doubt, that my father had thought of everything. On nothing more than a hunch, I searched the county property records. The public ones, the ones anyone can look at if they only know to look, and there it was, plain as daylight. The lake house, the very house Vivian was so eager to list, by spring, had been retitled years earlier. It had been placed into a living trust. It was not, and had not been for 4 full years, any part of the probate estate that my mother and my sister were so busy dividing between them at the kitchen table. They were fighting, in deadly earnest, over a house that my father had quietly and legally moved entirely beyond their reach before either of them had even noticed it was gone. And it had never once occurred to them to check the public record. Of course it hadn't. Why would it? They had the narrative. The narrative said the house was theirs, and in our family the narrative had always been stronger than any fact. I confirmed, too, and I cannot tell you how much this came to matter, that the documents had been properly witnessed and notarized, signed in front of neutral parties who had no stake whatsoever in the outcome. At first it seemed a dry technicality. Then I understood it for the shield it was. Because I knew, as well as I knew my own name, exactly what my family's first move would be the instant the truth came out. They would say that I had manipulated him. That quiet, scheming Nell had isolated a sick old man, whispered poison in his ear, bent his fragile mind to her own ends. My mother had already been seeding precisely that story for weeks. But you cannot make that accusation stick to a trust drafted 4 years before a man's death, by an independent attorney his other daughter had never even met, signed before disinterested witnesses, accompanied by a physician's written note as to his soundness of mind. My father had not merely recorded his wishes. He had armored them against the exact attack he knew was coming. He had sat in that quiet glass office and imagined the accusation his own family would one day make. And he had defeated it 4 years in advance. I had nearly everything I needed when the family, knowing nothing, tightened the noose around their own necks. Vivian, impatient as ever, scheduled a walkthrough. A prospective buyer was to tour the lake house, the house she did not own, the very next week. And my mother announced what she called a family meeting, to be held, of all places at that same house, to finalize a few things, and assign the last of the items, and, I had no doubt, to apply the gentle, relentless pressure that would get practical Nell to sign whatever needed signing to push the sale along. They wanted me there. They needed me there, the sensible one, to handle the details. They were, without the faintest flicker of understanding, scheduling the precise hour and place of their own collision with everything my father had set in motion. And I would be there, sitting quietly in his chair, holding the proof in a folder on my lap. I called Margaret Cho, and I asked her if she would come. The day of the family meeting I arrived early, before any of them, and I sat in my father's chair by the window and watched the light move on the water while I waited for my family to gather and divide up a life that was no longer theirs to touch. Vivian arrived with a folder of her own, fat with listing paperwork and what she kept calling, brightly, the plan. My mother arrived and immediately began arranging the room the way she arranged everything in her life, deciding where each of us would sit, positioning herself at the head. They laid the whole thing out for me with a brisk and terrible generosity, the way you might explain something to a slow child. The house would sell. The proceeds would be divided. The larger share to Vivian, to help her settle her situation. A comfortable portion to my mother, and for me, my mother said, with that soft warm smile I had chased my entire life, there would be something special of your father's, so you'll always have a piece of him. A keepsake. After 6 years of Sunday drives, they had decided I would be grateful for a keepsake. I sat very still, and I let them finish. I had spent my whole life letting them finish, and when Vivian slid the listing agreement across the table toward me, and held out her pen with a little encouraging smile. I did not reach for it. I looked at the two of them, at the women who had narrated me into the corners of my own family for nearly 50 years. And I said, in the calmest voice I have ever heard come out of my own body, actually, there's something the two of you should see first. And, as if the house itself had been waiting for the line, there was a knock at the door. I will not pretend there was nothing fierce and bright moving through me as I rose to answer it. I had earned that feeling, and I let myself have it. I opened the door, and Margaret Cho stepped into my father's living room with her leather case in her hand, and that paid for stillness about her, and I watched the confusion ripple across my mother's carefully composed face, and I watched the very first flicker of real fear cross my sister's. Margaret introduced herself with quiet authority. She explained, in the unhurried voice of a woman who has done this many difficult times, that she had represented James Briggs in his final years, and that there were documents the family needed to be made fully aware of before any decision about the property went a single step further. And then she set her case on the table, opened it, drew out a bound sheaf of papers, and began to read. She read the trust, and she read it plainly, without a trace of drama, which somehow made every word land harder than any raised voice could have. 4 years prior, my father had placed the lake house, the surrounding land, and the substantial majority of his financial accounts into a revocable living trust. Upon his death, that trust named a single trustee, vested with full authority over its administration, and a single primary beneficiary to receive its assets. That trustee and that beneficiary was me, Eleanor Briggs. There were provisions for the others. My father had not been a vengeful man. A specific and generous sum set aside to keep my mother secure and comfortable for the rest of her natural life, and a smaller, conditional bequest for Vivian. But the house was mine. The land was mine. The bulk of everything my father had built across the long, careful decades of his life was mine, and had been mine, in intention and in law, for 4 years, while the two of them sat at his kitchen table and planned around me as though I were a chair to be sold with the dining set. The room did not erupt the way you might be imagining. There was, instead, a terrible and absolute silence. The silence of a story collapsing in real time, the silence of a reality that had stood for 30 years suddenly finding it had no floor beneath it. My mother's hand rose slowly to her throat. Vivian's face moved through 3 or 4 expressions in the space of a breath, denial and calculation and fear, and none of them found anywhere to land. And then Margaret reached into her case once more and handed me a second envelope. A personal one, my father's own handwriting across the front, which he had instructed her to give me on exactly this day, in exactly this room. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and I read it aloud, because some part of me needed all of us to hear his voice in that house one more time, the family included. He had written it the way he spoke, plainly, in the careful hand of a man who built things to last. He wrote that he had spent a long time watching, and that he knew precisely who had shown up and who had only ever taken. He wrote about the Sunday drives. He wrote about the medications, and about the coffee he'd known all along I had been quietly weakening. He wrote, "I'm not doing this to punish anyone, Nell. I'm doing it because I'm tired of pretending I didn't see what I saw every day for years. I'm finally telling the truth out loud." And near the end there was a single line that I have never once been able to read without my throat closing around it. "You never needed me to choose you, but I wanted to anyway. I had spent my entire life waiting to be chosen. And there it was, in my father's hand, 4 years old, patient as a foundation poured deep below the frost line, waiting all this time for the day I would finally need it." It was Margaret, gently and professionally, almost as an administrative footnote, who delivered the last and sharpest turn, which somehow made it more devastating than any accusation thrown across the table could have been. As the trustee, she explained to me, I now carried a legal duty to account for all of the trust's assets, and in beginning that accounting a problem had already surfaced. There were transfers, significant ones, made under power of attorney in the final months of my father's life, that did not appear to have been made for his benefit. Those transfers would have to be explained. And if they could not be properly justified, they would have to be repaid to the trust in full. She said it without a drop of venom, in the same even tone she'd used to read the deed, the way an honest accountant notes a discrepancy in a column. But every person in that room understood exactly what it meant. The withdrawals I had quietly photographed and dated and filed away for weeks were no longer my private knowledge to carry. They were now a legal matter of record, raised by an officer of the court in front of witnesses. My patience, my long deliberate silence, had become, without my ever once raising my voice, lawful and unavoidable consequence. What followed was not the screaming, table-pounding catharsis you might want from me, and I have made a real and lasting peace with that, because I have learned that true justice almost never arrives that way. It arrives in paperwork. It arrives in the slow, undeniable, irreversible settling of facts onto people who built their lives on the assumption that facts could always be rearranged. Vivian tried denial first. She said it had to be a mistake, that the old family lawyer surely had the real documents, that their father would never have done this, not to them, not to her. When Margaret calmly cited the dates and the neutral witnesses and the recorded deed, my sister pivoted hard to accusation. The exact one I had predicted, weeks before. Sitting alone with a folder, I had manipulated him. I had isolated a sick old man and turned him against his own family. And it was almost worth every silent year to watch that accusation die in the air between us, because the documents were 4 years old and drafted by a woman Vivian had never laid eyes on, witnessed by strangers, and there was simply nowhere on earth for the lie to stand. And then, at last, came the bargaining, and beneath the bargaining, finally, the raw truth of her desperation. The debts, the failed venture, the loans, the whole gleaming life built on money no one had ever actually promised her. She was not a monster. She was a woman who had been told since girlhood that she was owed the world, and she was watching, in real time, the bill come due all at once. My mother's collapse was quieter, and in a way I had not braced for, far harder to watch. She had spent 40 years as the sole author of our family's reality, deciding who mattered, deciding whose version of events would be remembered, arranging every fact to flatter the conclusion she had reached long ago. And now she sat in her dead husband's living room and understood, slowly, that her chosen daughter would not be in control of anything, and that the daughter she had spent a lifetime dismissing now held the entire family's future in her quiet, capable hands. The woman who had narrated me into the background of my own life had, suddenly, nothing left to narrate. She looked at me. Really looked, I think, for the first time in my memory. And there was something in her face that was not yet an apology, but was perhaps the raw ground where an apology might one day be planted, if either of us lived long enough to tend it. Margaret laid out the legal reality for them without a shred of melodrama, and I was grateful for that, because the plainness of it was its own kind of mercy and its own kind of finality. There were no grounds to contest the trust. Any challenge would fail and would only burn through money that, in Vivian's case, did not exist. The sale was finished before it began. There was no house to sell, because the house had never belonged to them to put on the market. The misused funds would need to be repaid, or a formal claim could and would be brought. These were not threats, and Margaret did not deliver them as threats. They were simply the shape the truth takes once it stops being hidden and is finally allowed to stand up in the room and be counted. The prospective buyer arrived in the very middle of all of it, which I could not have arranged if I'd tried. The realtor and a polite, hopeful couple appeared at the front door, for the walk-through Vivian had so confidently scheduled, the one she'd been so certain of, and I went to meet them myself while my mother sat frozen and my sisters stared at the floor. And I want you to understand what that single moment meant for a woman who had spent her whole life being told, in 100 small ways, to make herself smaller and to take up less room. I stood in the doorway of the house I had tended every Sunday for 6 years, the house that was now, in law and in love and in the careful 4-year-old will of the man who built it, entirely mine. And I told them, kindly, that I was so sorry for the confusion, but the house was not for sale. Ownership, I learned in that doorway, looks nothing like entitlement. Entitlement is loud and it assumes, and it makes lists on other people's refrigerators. Ownership simply, quietly, closes the door. There is one more thing I need you to know about that day, because it is the part I am most proud of, and it is also the part that took the most strength I have ever had to summon. I chose not to destroy them. I could have. I held the documentation to pursue Vivian to the very end, to leave my mother with the bare legal minimum, and let the same relatives who had whispered about my jealousy watch her struggle for the rest of her days. And there was a version of me, forged in every overlooked year, In every list I was left off of, that wanted exactly that, with a hunger that frightened me a little. But I found, standing in my father's house, that I did not want to become the loud, grasping, scorekeeping thing I had spent my entire life sitting across the table from. So I set terms instead. Vivian would repay the trust, on a structured schedule she could actually meet, with the debt acknowledged plainly in writing, so that it could never again be narrated into something else. My mother would keep every bit of the security my father had set aside for her, and would live out her years in genuine comfort, though no longer in command. The strength, I have come to understand, was never going to be found in the revenge. It was in the restraint. In the weeks that came after, I sat alone in the lake house more than once, and the house itself changed around me as I sat in it. For 6 years I had moved through those rooms as a caretaker. A guest with a duty, someone tending, with great love, another person's life and another person's home. Now I moved through the very same rooms, past the same worn floorboards, and the same wide window with its view over the water, as the keeper of my father's truest wishes, and everything in the place meant something it had not meant before. Grief and belonging braided themselves together inside me in a way I had never anticipated and did not try to untangle. The house was full of him in every board he had set and every shelf he had hung. And now, at long last, it was also, fully and without apology, allowed to be mine. Vivian called me, eventually, and she apologized, and I want to be honest with you about that call, because the honest version of it matters far more to me than the satisfying one would. She said the words, and I believe some real part of her meant them, in the way people mean things once the ground has finally given way beneath their certainty. But I did not pretend that those words erased 30 years, and I did not hand her the warm, instant, tearful reconciliation that would have made everyone in the family comfortable again, while changing absolutely nothing underneath. I told her plainly that I accepted her apology, and that forgiveness, for me, was going to be a private and a slow and an honest thing, not a switch I could flip to spare her the discomfort of what she had done, and not a door swinging back open to a room where I could be used again. There was no movie, ending embrace. There were just two grown women, at last telling each other something true, which is its own kind of beginning, and far more than we had ever managed to give each other before. And recognition came, in the end, in exactly the way I had always longed for it, and had long ago stopped expecting. Not because I argued my case, not because I finally raised my voice and demanded to be seen, but because the facts arrived all on their own, and could not be sent away. The trust accounting, the recorded deed, the quiet word that travels through any family once the official version cannot be denied. All of it slowly corrected the story my mother had spent decades so carefully telling. The cousins and the old friends who had murmured that I was difficult, that I was bitter, that I had always resented my brilliant sister, learned who had actually made the 3-hour drive every Sunday for 6 years, who had paid for the care, whom my father had chosen, and exactly why he had chosen her. I never had to plead for a word of it. The truth did the work, just as my father had trusted it would when he sat in that glass office and armored it against the day. 4 full years before he was gone, I keep his letter now in the drawer of his desk. The same small locked drawer that once held Margaret Cho's card. And I read it sometimes, when the house has gone quiet and the light is failing over the water the way he always loved best, in the chair where he used to sit. You never needed me to choose you, but I wanted to anyway. For nearly 50 years I believed that being unseen was simply a fact about me, something true and fixed and permanent, the way you believe the weather is just the weather. It was never a fact. It was only ever a story, and it belonged to someone else, and I had been handed it so young that I mistook it for my own. And the people who quietly do the right thing, who show up when no one is watching, who keep their ledger honest, who tend the house and weaken the coffee and never once make a list. Sometimes, after all, someone is watching. Sometimes the truth has been waiting patiently in a locked drawer the whole time, sure and steady as a foundation poured deep below the frost, ready to rise up at the exact moment you finally need it to hold. So let me ask you one thing before I go. Have you ever been the one who was always fine? The one everyone counted on and no one ever quite counted? If you have, I'd truly like to know. Tell me your story, and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. And if you believe, the way I have finally learned to believe, that the truth has a way of finding the people who quietly earned it, Then stay with me here. There are more of these stories to tell, and I promise you this much: the truth wins far more often than the loud people would ever have you believe.